All right, we're going to get started. Just want to wish everybody good afternoon, and I want to thank you all for being here. Our presentation today is called Breaking the Silence. It's going to be a roundtable discussion about men's mental health that focuses on men's mental health, masculinity, the way society, culture, and personal experiences influence how men express emotions, handle stress, and seek support. While conversations about mental health have become more common in recent years, men we know still struggle with opening up about emotional challenges just because of stigma, fear of judgment, and just expectations tied to masculinity. So during this discussion, we're going to explore how childhood socialization, cultural expectations, loneliness, stigma, trauma, and just rigid gender norms can affect men's emotional well-being in their relationships. We also want to discuss how these challenges may appear different across communities, how unhealthy coping mechanisms can develop when emotional needs go unaddressed, and just overall, our goal today is going to be to better understand how certain expectations can impact mental health and relationships. We want to create a space for honest conversation about what healthy masculinity, emotional strength, and support could look like in today's society and understand the importance of emotional expression, connections, and support systems for men's overall mental health. So, just as we move through each section, we encourage everyone to reflect and think about how families, schools, communities, and relationships can help create healthier environments where men feel safe expressing themselves and seek the support that is needed. So, with that being said, I'd like to start out with introducing John, um, and he's going to talk about early socialization and trauma. And I did want to kind of start out with, too, John, a question that I know is really important. We've talked about, and a lot of people really, wonder how are boys taught to deal with sadness differently than girls? Like, what has your experience been? And if you could talk upon that, I think that would be really important.
Sure. Thanks, Kimberly. I'm John, Program Director in New Hampshire. So I kind of pulled a lot of this, kind of keeping with the theme of, breaking the silence. So some of what I speak about might be kind of some from personal experience or things that I've observed, while also kind of deep diving into a little bit of the research. But so socialization begins before children can even speak, right? We're we're learning from our parents, and how they describe their own emotional experiences. And what I came across is that there's those experiences are described differently to infant daughters than to infant sons. There's varied and nuanced emotional languages used with girls from as early as 18 months. The research I came across challenges that assumption of that gender socialization begins once children are old enough to actually understand those messages. So they're learning and absorbing at a pre-verbal level, that is later hard to kind of revise, for lack of a better word. Um, you know, for instance, caregivers might use richer, more varied emotional language with daughters than with their sons as early as 18 months. Uh, they're naming a broader range of emotions and might linger longer on the emotional content with daughters, whereas with sons, that emotional reference, they're typically briefer, less varied, and more likely to focus on anger or excitement than sadness or fear. Um, Part of what came up is that reminiscing, the way parents are narrating those experiences they've shared with their young children. Um, with daughters, it's more focused on emotional causes, consequences, and resolutions. Like, remember when you fell and you were scared? But with sons, it's that same experience tend to be narrated with the emotional content stripped out, focusing on what happened, how it was fixed, rather than how it felt. Um, so I thought that was pretty interesting that from an early age where, men are often, not across the board, but are often getting the message that, we're not talking about these emotions. We're fixing it. This is what happened. Um, then some of the nomenclature, some of the words that are used or phrases kind of do double duty, like boys will be boys. I think we've all heard that. Depending on the situation, right? It might be used to excuse that aggressive or externalizing behavior. Um, while internally it gives a signal that, our internal emotional experience is irrelevant or unimportant. It's like you did this thing, you're a boy, you're just being a boy, rather than why, like what was the feeling involved in it. Um, so a lot of this comes from, many households, fathers modeling that emotional suppression. Not necessarily for like, don't feel, don't do this, but maybe by being physically present, but at the same time, emotionally unavailable. Kind of teaching that nonverbal, this is just simply how it is. Like that's just, that's what it is being a man. Very similar to that boys will be boys, man up, right? We got to push through it. Um, then you get into schools and how they're structured to support the emotional engagement of boys. Where classrooms, this is where I pull from a little bit of personal experience because I might not present it now, but as a kid, I was all over the place, bouncing off the walls. I couldn't play t-ball because I couldn't sit still in the dugout. I couldn't sit still in class. Uh, but the classrooms I was a part of rewarded sitting still, rewarded that compliance, and being able to take in that verbal processing, which is a disadvantage to many boys. And they begin to behave, have behavioral struggles. And the response is often punitive, right? It's disciplinary rather than being like, okay, what's really going on here? Um, and all this just kind of boils down to just kind of that I can't even pronounce the word alexithymia, right? That difficulty identifying and describing our own emotional states. This challenge is is significantly more prevalent in men. And it's a learned behavior, a modeled behavior that we have learned throughout our childhood, adolescence, that follows us into adulthood, which really, by that adolescent age, a lot of boys have developed that mask of masculinity, that performance of being tough and confident. It's that armor that you hear about. And then the tragedy is over time that becomes more permanent, right? Even when we recognize it and want to change it. So when we want to take off that armor, it becomes even more difficult.
And John, what do you think are what might men express sadness or anger or withdraw instead of vulnerability? Like, why do you think that? Do you think that's more from, the environment, from the family, from society? What do you think really triggers that?
Well, I think it kind of connects down to over time, right? It's how boys are shamed maybe for being vulnerable, right? We've had that armor up or been taught like we're not expressing these emotions. If we get into the neurological pathways, anger and sadness both activate that limbic system. Although anger triggers the sympathetic nervous system, it arouses us, makes us feel activated, even empowered, where sadness involves the parasympathetic collapse. It feels much more like helplessness. And for men conditioned to avoid helplessness, anger is the most tolerable, preferred method of, feeling those feelings. Um, so oftentimes, especially for boys and adolescents who've been either directly shamed for, feeling sad or being vulnerable, um, they can kind of start changing that internal dialogue from I feel sad into I feel wronged, which then justifies that anger, that externalization. Um, it's it's that emotional reframing, and it happens oftentimes. It's not a conscious cognitive thing. It's like an automatic cognitive trigger in our brain. Um, but then you have I think excuse me. Whereas we have the men that are expressing angrily, we also have the withdrawal functions that serve much of the same function. Men go quiet, become distant, disappear into their work, disappear into their screens, substances, things like that. So um, this also kind of goes right into men frequently not choosing to seek treatment, like mental health treatment, right? They don't have that therapeutic alliance because they're always entering in through the side door. Maybe it's an ultimatum from a partner, or it's just rarely self-referred. There's always a reason they have to do it, right? They're never being like, I'm choosing to. And that gets us into like some of the unresolved long-term effects of this suppression. And one of I love this author, Gabor Mate, and I've gotten a chance to see him speak, and he has a lot of things of a lot of writing and research about how that affects us physically. Um, it can turn into that emotional expression can turn into different autoimmune diseases, heart disease, all these things that really affect our body, even cancer. Um, so that relationship between all that unresolved trauma or sadness and chronic illness is robust. I mean, the adverse childhood experiences studies, that's been spoke about in a lot of different trainings revolving trauma that I've been to. Um, but it's interesting, that direct connection to emotions, suppressing emotions, and our own physical well-being.
And so that unprocessed emotional pain kind of shows up both behaviorally and physically, John, is kind of what you're saying. And that's kind of
Yeah,
something that you're saying. Yeah,
yeah, yeah.
definitely.
It's and chronic emotional suppression can lead directly to chronic illness.
There's higher incidence of heart attack and stroke risk and things like that for males as well, medically, if they go undiagnosed and untreated for mental health services. So absolutely,
Yeah.
definitely. And I know that kind of ties into, just a little bit about kind of coping and how that works. And then I know, Esteban, you wanted kind of to cover a little bit about kind of culture, identity, and coping. And so just kind of looking at how some of mental health and the coping can impact, and how identity and things all play into that. So I want to have you go next and you can explain a little bit about that because I think that's very important for us to understand as well.
Absolutely. Thank you, Kimberly, and thank you, John, for your intro, for the intro into this space. And so I am Esteban Rios. I'm a licensed clinical social worker, and I serve as the director for internships and training for our New York regions with Northeast Family Services. And yeah, just really to kind of highlight a little bit about healthy versus unhealthy coping skills. So really, but before I actually talk about that, John, you referenced societal expectations about being strong and resilient. That could also really lead to like internalized pressures that to hide our vulnerabilities. So especially BIPOC men specifically can often be taught to carry stress quietly, right? And myself being a Latino man, I was certainly raised to be strong while staying silent. And so that can actually help to develop unhealthy coping mechanisms that when you think about some of the barriers to care, that particular experience of having to be basically resilient and silent and quiet, well, that why would you actually then go out and start talking about not feeling well, not feeling depressed, feeling anxious, having all of these particular quote unquote symptoms that are going on that are these stressors that are affecting your life? Why would you actually then go out and start seeking help? So these expectations create a very intense pressure, especially if one feels that they can't meet the roles that they're supposed to that are set for them, sometimes due to economic challenges, due to discrimination. Ongoing experiences of racism and discrimination also can lead to chronic stress, as you mentioned about chronic illness and chronic stress affecting one's mental health well-being. But one of the things I also want to highlight in terms of discrimination related stress is microaggressions in daily life, specifically for BIPOC men, contribute to a sense of exclusion and isolation, which is definitely also piggybacking off what you would just describe when you had described isolation, John, can really further complicate one's emotional health. So some really unhealthy, I'm just going to mention the unhealthy coping mechanisms that come up, substance use. So some BIPOC men may turn to, or even and just non-identifying BIPOC men might turn to alcohol or substance use as a means to escape their realities, coping with the underlying pain and stress associated with having to be, again, resilient and strong, and again, those societal expectations, the emotional suppression itself, that societal stigma of having to bottle up your feelings can also manifest into the physical and mental health issues. And overworking, the expectation of having to be the provider, the quote unquote breadwinner, right? Exacerbates the mental health issues, and also prevents individuals from addressing those needs and actually seeking help. What are some of the healthy coping strategies that come up? Engaging with friends, family, and even cultural groups. So sometimes we will find situations where, oh, well, let's develop a men's support group and bring men together into a space to start talking. And then the first thing you do, and the first thing that's done, and, to be quite honest, is the session is actually conducted by a woman, the facilitation is with a woman, but there's this in that moment, having now the expectation of the facilitator, who is a cisgender female identifying therapist or provider, now has to break that stigma in the room to be able to be accepted into the space. And sometimes it tends to be a little easier for men who are seeking help to what they tend to look for their cultural groups. So sometimes men are looking for men therapists, they're looking for Latino male therapists, Black identifying male therapists, to kind of break that one particular wall down that's saying, okay, well, he might understand me a little bit better, possibly because he also identifies as a man. Spirituality and faith. Many BIPOC men do find solace in spirituality, which can often comfort and also provide a framework for understanding life changes. So that is something that definitely comes up. I mean, we do hear about that, just overall, recognizing that spirituality and faith does play a role in supporting mental health treatment. But specifically for BIPOC men, as I'm identifying specifically right now, that also does play a role. You do have some men who will go to their pastor and have a conversation with their pastor. And of course, I will always promote therapy, encouraging therapy as a means of self-exploration and healing. It's definitely important to normalize seeking professional help. So although we're talking about a particular area of concern with men and mental health, we don't have a lot of male identifying therapists out in the field as much as we do have female identifying therapists. So it really is important for us as male therapists to help educate and highlight some of the areas that we experience as ourselves, not only just as men providers, but as men who have these feelings and have life stressors and have experiences that affect us both from a societal and cultural perspective, but also from a professional perspective as well. And where does that line blur to be able to provide all providers, whether you're male identifying or female identifying, with the tools to understand men's mental health and kind of like where that lies and where that sits. So those that stigma within the communities is something that I feel like male identifying therapists can help bridge that gap, especially for our colleagues who are female identifying therapists.
Esteban, do you know if there's anything specific, as a female therapist or just in general as like a mother, wife of someone that is, having mental health issues? Is there something specific that we could do, like you said, to kind of bridge that gap? Is there something you think that would be helpful? Because I know you mentioned a lot of great information. What do you think would be like, is there one takeaway for us that we could kind of help with that gap?
Um, Absolutely. I think that being a part of that community support is definitely understanding what that is and understanding a male's perspective in that space. So the men in your life that you might identify as, hey, they might need someone to talk to. I'm recognizing these isolating and uh, siloed type of behaviors. I'm recognizing that there's some silence here. There is something going on where he's not expressing himself, right? He's actually struggling with many different things. There might be some substance use, there might be some even some really self-destructive behaviors. There might be some aggression, some anger, some violence,
Mhm.
even. What do you do? Well, taking a look at what are some of the aspects in that particular man's life that he leans on that are healthy? What are some of the things that he's already doing that represent healthy behavior? First thing that pops up into my head, especially today here in New York, and especially specifically in New York City, we've got the ticker tape parade for the, go Knicks. Couldn't find my orange shirt. But that particular emphasis on the enthusiasm, granted, in a healthy manner of engaging in sports and that community that comes with sports. That's like number one that people tend to lean on when you think of men and a healthy engagement. So leaning on that and encouraging that. No one is telling any woman in a man's life, now you basically now have to go be an expert in playing basketball, and now so that you can basically be recruited. No, it's really just encouraging that particular activity in the format in which they engage in the activity that you're recognizing. If it's playing music, if it's actually like I said, the specific sports, if it's gardening, if it's carpentry, if it's art, if it's actually dance, any type of expression that is an activity that they engage in that you recognize as healthy, that's always going to be the number one thing. Encouraging that to be done more often. And also do not have to feel pressured to also actively participate with him in the activity. It's the encouragement of him engaging in the activity, not saying, well, I want to do it with you so that you can be witness to it. You don't have to be witness to it, because that also brings on pressure as well, to the female identifying person who is providing the support and recognizing the need. So so that piece I also want to emphasize is, don't feel the pressure that you have to actively participate in that activity that may not be an activity for you. It's really just the encouragement of them doing it more often.
No, and I appreciate this because I really feel like, it's kind of a way to open up that emotional conversation because again, sports and activities, things that they're interested in, it's a great way to break down those barriers, to really kind of help open up that conversation. And it kind of leads us perfectly into Chris talking about emotional barriers and masculinity, like, and how those conversations can happen and those crucial things to help them be able to disclose. So Chris, I want you to be able to kind of go ahead and kind of answer to some of these because I think it's really important for us to understand that as well.
Yeah, absolutely. Tough acts to follow. My gosh, we've got some strong worded gentlemen in here. So I'm Chris. I'm an LICSW, born and raised in the wonderful state of Massachusetts. So again, to sort of reiterate that, why do men hesitate to engage in therapy or emotional conversations, right? From our youngest age, we are taught happy, mad, hungry, sad is how we get our needs met. We get conditioned, these needs get met, and we don't necessarily all expand that palette of emotions. Again, the earliest forms of social media or television or whatever we are screen timing these days, essentially we're taught that expressing emotion can be a sign of weakness, right? It goes all the way back to the GI Joe versus the Barbie. GI Joes look like something created out of a test tube, and Barbies look like what Barbies look like, and these are the toys we're thrown to play with. Again, we worry too much about being judged, misunderstood, or losing the respect of our peers, of our family, of our friends by saying, like, hey, I don't love that you did this that way, or this makes me upset. Um, again, there's also, they may not have the experience about openly talking about feelings. I can't express enough in my own work in clinical therapy, working with couples, working with individual males. A majority of them say, like, I've never even talked to somebody about being more than hangry in my life. And when that's your most pivotal emotional response is, you're have a Snickers, you're not you and you're hungry. We can't expect that person to also have the emotional intelligence to navigate something, from one end of the spectrum as traumatic as we'll go there, like a miscarriage or, infidelity or, I don't know, questioning their sexuality, to something all the way back to, I'm hungry. I'm going to go to Cumberland Farms and get a Snickers and feel better about my day. Again, and I'll pivot that into the self-disclosure. Sharing personal struggles can create fear of rejection or criticism. How many of us walk up to any situation and immediately want to be accepted by peers? It's why we all dress a certain way. It's why we all probably go nuts at times trying to figure out what tie to wear. Is it business casual? Is it casual? Can I wear the cardigan? I don't own a cardigan, but I can wear a button down. Esteban's laughing at me because he knows it too. It can feel like giving up control or exposing vulnerabilities. And self-disclosure is so difficult when you come to that grip of like, yeah, this person hurt me deeply. And every day I think about it. Every day I pass that stop sign and I think about this. Or every day I hear that song and I think about this. And actually voicing that and communicating with somebody, the biggest piece of it is trust. You have to trust that person you're communicating with is not going to either give you terrible advice or give you no advice. They're a soundboard. I can't tell you how many men and young emerging adult males I've worked with in individual counseling, couples counseling as well. Even at times in the professional world as a supervisee, where they come and they speak to me about something and they just say, hey, if it's a supervisee, it's more along the lines of, I'm not at 100% today. And my clinical brain is always, okay, professionally, what's going on? And they're like, oh, I didn't think there'd be a follow-up. Well, yeah, we're therapists. Some of us in this clinical world of language and articulation around emotional intelligence, we don't even think about helping ourselves in therapy. And it's just, there's that missing link in terms of nature and nurture, where we grow up conditioned in some way, shape, or form in our homes to not articulate our feelings because dad didn't do that. Grandpa didn't do that. We knew dad was upset because the game was on the loudest it could be and nobody went into that side of the house, right? We heard the Red Sox get smoked, and then we went to bed. You're welcome for the Yankees fans watching, but we have our moments, and in turn, vice versa. We take that, and how many of us shy away and go to the gym and don't say a word, throw on music and just, beat ourselves up physically to not necessarily focus on the emotional toll that we're having taken on us. And then there's the expectations around masculinity influencing how men talk about relationships. You take that back, and I'll use the gym as an example. How many guys go to the gym and talk to each other about, oh yeah, this date, da 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 da. None of them are saying, yeah, man, I got cheated on this weekend. It feels terrible. And putting themselves into, a high rocks workout or a CrossFit workout until they can't walk anymore. Men feel pressure to appear confident, strong, and emotionally unaffected. Like we know this, and it was reiterated from John to Esteban. It's a common theme. Confidence, strength, emotionally unaffected. I told several people, I'm nervous about this today, and that right there was me trying to practice what we preach with our own teams and getting some support from the people that I can draw on that support for, who recognize that, yeah, it's okay to be nervous and it's okay to be male and it's okay to talk about that. It's not necessarily an insecurity, a fear, or an emotional need, but it is, coming to terms with that emotional intelligence around, hey, we're going to tackle some tough things, or we're going to tackle some emotions. It doesn't need to be taboo. It can be something that we're all cool, calm, collected, and comfortable talking about. And I think so much of what we do, at least in therapy, and I think it applies elsewhere as well, is, being comfortable, being uncomfortable. The amount of people out there who are already afraid to talk about their emotions. Um, that gets brought into it in terms of where it's just this inside feeling of anxiety and stress and frustration and apprehension and hesitation to communicate those feelings. John, feel free.
Yeah. So it's really interesting that, I feel like we're all kind of aware of some of these things that we're trying to break down, at least I like within ourselves, right? Trying to be more tuned into the emotional piece. And it brings me to just something I was thinking about with me and some of my close male friends. We're all trying to be in touch. Like we'll say I love you and stuff, and we don't think it's weird or anything, where some other friend groups maybe they might. But even when we're trying, it feels like so kind of ingrained that it goes only a certain distance, and then for us, it goes into busting on each other or some comic relief to relieve that tension. Not that we're scared about like saying, I love you, brother, you're my brother, but it's that weird innate feeling of like, okay, that's enough emotion. Let's make it funny so we can laugh and relieve that tension.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah, again, I think we've all at this point, maybe, hopefully not, I don't know, but those of us who have, had trauma, had loss, had grief, had, a relationship end, and then going to a friend and being like, hey, oh man, that really hit me hard today. And the response you get is, oh, that sucks, but I could hit you harder. Like it just is those types of colloquial conversation banter, as you stated, like, it's a back and forth of when is it going to get funny? When is it going to get sardonic? When is it going to get to a point where it's no longer, yeah, but who did you pick up in the waiver wire for fantasy football this week? Um, again, and I recognizing I'm losing time quickly here. Just in terms of vulnerability coexisting with traditional ideas of strength, I just want to say that yes, strength can and should include being honest about emotions and challenges. Oftentimes in couples therapy, when I'm working with clients, it becomes a battle of back and forth of who's right and who's wrong. And I promise you, it does not matter who's right and wrong in that moment, because we can keep a scoreboard of who's right and who's wrong and tally it up at the end of 6 months. The only thing that's going to make sense is how you've communicated with each other, because words last a lot longer than tallies. Again, a man can ask for help when he's taking responsibility for his actions. That's not a weakness. That's me saying, hey, I made a mistake. Help me not make the same mistake in the future so we can benefit the workplace, the team, the relationship, the friendship. We can also communicate openly with a partner, even when the conversations feel uncomfortable. Hey, the examples that I have are what they are, but it's, in terms of sexuality, in terms of independence and individuality, like, you should be able to have a safe conversation with somebody you're in a relationship with. And then lastly, the small ways men can begin to open up without feeling overwhelmed. Start by sharing one feeling or concern with a trusted friend or partner. Hey, it really stinks that you leave the cabinets open every day and I have to go through and close them. Like, it might seem like the smallest thing in the world to you, but to somebody else, that's the difference of them walking into a very, clean, happy, peaceful home versus seeing one more thing they have to do that day. You can use simple statements like, I've been stressed lately, or I'm having a hard time with this, or, I want to express how I'm feeling in a way that doesn't create chaos or friction. Um, I don't practice this one myself, but I've had a ton of people, and maybe I should start journaling or regular check-ins with people you can connect with who, are emotionally sort of deep, but also able to say like, hey, you know what? I'm a little burnt out on hearing about, your X, Y, and Z. I want you to feel validated, but I also recognize my own bandwidth too. That doesn't happen with therapists because that's our job. We never run out of bandwidth for our people. So,
Well, and Chris, that kind of ties in. There's a really good question that someone's actually just recently started a men's support group, and they said that they're getting a really hard time to get men to come to meetings. So they wanted to ask to the group, and I know John and Esteban, you have some information about this, but what would be some tips or tricks that they can get them to attend the meetings more regularly? What would be some of your suggestions? What do you think could be helpful?
Um, maybe by chance not call it a support group. Maybe have it focused more like because the name how it's identified can really affect it. Like you might have a hard time of males coming to a support group or anything like that. But if it's is it I know you're not gonna be able to answer this necessarily out loud, but like is it focused on something like fatherhood, recovery? Does it have like an intent, like something that the members are going to do? That might be helpful rather than a vague support group. And not saying that's what you're trying to put out there. And food is probably a good motivator for to get people to come in.
Yeah, I actually just co-facilitated a men's support group, right? And we didn't call it that on the flyer. But one of the things that we did talk about was a space for men to really just be in a space to talk to each other, just to talk to each other. And what we found was we to remove the pressure of if again it was virtual. So we removed the pressure of people having to have their cameras on. If people, we removed the pressure of like you've got to attend every single session, you've got to say something. It really was just a space, and it was themed, and we just kind of talked things through. And it wasn't a high attendance. I'd say like the most that we had in 1 week, and it was for 6 weeks. The highest attendance was like 4. The lowest was like 2. But one of the things that I could say that was most successful is there was one person that attended the group all 6 sessions. And at the end of the group, one of the things that he said was, I was reluctant to attend this group, but once I was in the space with other people that kind of sounded like me, said that had similar experiences, and we allowed them to engage in the conversations themselves. Not easy to do, but so the way we promoted and continue to support it in the in between was like speaking to all of those. We would touch base with all of the individuals who did attend and didn't attend and say, hey, so and so and so and so missed you. They did ask about you. And it's not that we weren't being inauthentic, we were telling the truth. But we did say, like, hey, the group in general did ask about you, and they were curious to know if you would be attending. And 9 times out of 10, the reasons why they didn't attend was because of the other lifestyle obligations that came up, and not necessarily meaning that they didn't want to attend because they don't want to be in that space. There were some that were, and then they felt like they weren't ready to be in a group setting in that capacity. There was a little bit of a safety with regards to it being hybrid, and then you can turn your camera off and you can be present but not present. We all know what that looks like and feels like. But that was something so those are some tips to kind of hopefully that might help. Don't put the heavy duty pressure on like large attendance. If literally you go through the entire series, however long you're going to do it, and only 2 people show up, those are 2 people that successfully attended that group and got exactly what you were intending on the group to be.
Yeah.
Esteban, I think that's yeah, go ahead. Go ahead.
I was gonna say word of mouth is powerful too. Bring a friend. I think, John nailed it too, and Esteban nailed it too. Calling it a support group is so tough. I mean, I would almost divert to a topic, something that is relatable, that's not super focused on the idea that it is clinical. There was one when I was in grad school. Somebody had to do one as a internship presentation, and they focused it on just like a pickup basketball game, and it became this pickup basketball game that took on a life of its own, and eventually included folding chairs and a picnic table, and everybody brought them, and they all talked. And I don't know that they lived happily ever after, but it certainly diverted away from the idea of rolled ankles and torn ACLs. So sometimes, just like when we play, catch with a kid, or play a game with a kid, they focus on one thing and really they start opening up on the other side of things. How often we use like Magic or Pokemon or chess to, engage a client in something, and then also that vicarious nature of them then, oh, well, I haven't played this in a long time since, grandpa passed away. Those types of conversations can, organically come from that activity.
No, and Chris, I think, like we talked about support groups and doing things with friends and peers. like that really kind of ties perfectly into kind of going right into what Bradley's going to talk about is how to prevent loneliness and isolation in that man box and what that looks like. And I know someone put in the chat as well that there's an organization that they belong to, stayforlife.org. So that could be something as well. So there's a lot of resources. But Bradley, go ahead. I'd love to hear, and talk about that important piece of, how can someone develop these deep emotional connections and friendships? Because that's really key as well for mental health.
Sure thing. Hello, everyone. My name is Bradley Connors. I'm a licensed independent clinical social worker and the assistant program director here in Rhode Island. First off, I just want to thank my three colleagues for presenting before me. Your life experience and your depth of knowledge is admirable, and I think these are the types of conversations that we can offer to help change the direction of these topics that we're talking about. So first off, I just want to speak about this social theory called the man box. It is a framework that was developed in the 1980s, and it helps to describe the cultural and societal pressures boys and men are exposed to, and often the ways in which they dictate how they interact with their both internal and external worlds. The man box is separated into 7 distinct pillars, which supports the idea that a real man must be tough and lack emotion and is often aggressive and dominant around in the world around him. So these are the pillars that I speak of. Self-sufficiency, not needing help. Okay, I think we have heard that echoed many times throughout this conversation today. Acting tough, both physical and emotional strength. Physical attractiveness, adhering to the physical standards of beauty. Rigid gender roles, adhering to the traditional gender roles, such as being the sole provider of a household. Heterosexuality, that all men must be heterosexual, and oftentimes this is accompanied by homophobia and the dismissal of anything deemed feminine. Sexual prowess, being hypersexual, constantly sexually active and dominant in those situations, and aggression, using force to resolve conflict. As we can hear, and as it's been echoed many times by my colleagues, these ideas are ones that are both like conscious and unconsciously sort of dictated through societal and cultural ways, which can help and can hurt the way in which men interact with our worlds. As you'll see that these tenets influence the next part of my conversation. The loneliness epidemic. The loneliness epidemic is something that has been impacted all aspects of society, both men and women, but in my opinion, it highlights the deficiencies in the ways in which we bring up our boys who become men in this modern world. In this hyper-independent capitalistic society we are all a part of, you are lauded for figuring out your problems and issues by yourself. But as 5 mental health professionals here, we often see firsthand that that's not the case. From a young age, men are told, don't cry, be a man, don't show weakness, which, if that messaging is supported throughout his life, could potentially create an adult who believes in his toughest moments, he can't ask for help, he can't show weakness, and he needs to figure it out on his own. When these moments come up in his life, what he could need most is actually connection and understanding, validation, and a safe place to be vulnerable, and to learn how to more effectively move through these experiences. The socialization of men to avoid their emotions and the weakness that it may cause creates a disconnect within them, which could promote isolation and loneliness, then unhealthy behaviors such as increased substance use, video game and phone use, problem gambling, and unsafe sexual activity. Now, I really tried to hesitate to just regurgitate information to all of you, but I found some particular statistics that I just thought really highlighted what it is that we all have been talking about for the last almost 50 minutes. So a 2023 survey reported that 2/3 of men from ages 18 to 23 reported that no one really knows me. There has been an increase of 12% since 1990 where men say, I have no close friends in my life. Only about 48% of men feel satisfied with their friendships. Men are just less likely to confide in their relationships. 1 in 5 men report getting emotional support from a friend in any given week. And as we said before, men are 4 times more likely than women to die by suicide. And loneliness has the same physiological impact on us as smoking 15 cigarettes. That is one that I have used many, many times. It just really shows what that does to us on a very physiological level. So maybe you're asking, how do we prevent this from occurring? How do we help our men? Well, there are some, and for my own opinion, some things that maybe we all can start to at least consider going forward. Maybe promoting emotional expression early in our development, in our life. Teaching tools for effective emotional and frustration management and praising the use of them. Maybe we can find ways to create useful third spaces for men to connect that aren't centered around drinking or sports, video games, or gambling, and to help facilitate the opportunity to genuinely connect with other men who are experiencing similar challenges. And last but not least, for those who are here and those who may hear this later, just approaching yourself or the men in your life with curiosity and grace and lack of judgment as you potentially begin the journey towards understanding and deeper connection with yourself and the world around you. Now, I know that there probably are some questions about like how or why do men struggle with deeper emotional connection? And in my humble opinion, I think we are all not often taught the relational skills necessary to cultivate and maintain deep emotional connection, such as being able to identify our own emotions and to learn the vulnerability necessary to communicate our internal worlds to those around us. And without that ability to be vulnerable, we lack the opportunity for sameness with those around us. And the inability to relate with those around us creates an idea that our story is unique and that no one can understand us, which oftentimes leads men to feel isolated and alone and desperate for answers. So again, these are just a small part of a much larger conversation, but I think that is, like I said, a great place and great information for all of us to take as we move forward in our days, our weeks, and our months, trying to help ourselves and the men around us.
I appreciate that, Bradley. I know there's a question too as well that kind of stemmed up from your conversation about mental health. And, the question was, do you think the topic of male mental health has become more normalized over the past decade? Person said it feels like yes, but as a provider, it's kind of hard to get the perspective of the average person not working in the field. Because again, it's coming from that therapist perspective that yes, over the last decade plus, like, yes, there's more understanding and interest in mental health for men and how to engage and being more aware of that and being sensitive to the differences between, that. But from your perspective, working, specifically as a male clinician working with male clients, like, how do you feel? Do you feel like there's still, I know there's always still room to improve, but have you seen a shift in kind of more progressive normalization of that? Or do you still feel that balance where we get the pushback where they're still not comfortable accessing services as needed?
I mean, I think the short answer, I think yes, there is it is more normalized these days. I mean, the fact that we are here on a Thursday afternoon doing a webinar about it, I think speaks volumes to where we have come. But of course, there's always more room for improvement, more normalized discussions, less stigmatization. But I think from my own personal experience, from my own mental health journey, and from those who I work around, I think we are seeing less resistance to it, more curiosity around it, and a desire to show up differently in the world. And I obviously hand it off to all my other colleagues here about how you feel about it too.
Yeah, no, I'll just piggyback on that a little bit. And I do think the normalization is out there. I just don't think it's as traditional and as cookie cutter as, Chris is now going to therapy once a week. I think it's, as much as I hate to give any credit to social media, right? Like we have outlets to repost something or to save something for later or to have access to music or art or words of affirmation or motivational speaking, whether it's on a TikTok or a reel or I don't know what else is out there these days. But I can't tell you how many times I've watched like a speech on TikTok during a workout where I just didn't want to be there. I was emotionally drained. I was physically drained. But then you listen to the wise words of Brady, Belichick, Kevin Garnett, some of these, really pivotal, passionate, and emotional people. I mean, Belichick, yeah, he has one emotion, but it comes with sleeves being cut off, and that's fine. But in terms of how we are expressing emotion, I think it's so much more important for the people around all of us as men, and not just limited to men, but to be aware, to see those signs, to pay attention. Oh man, they're posting some really, impactful things at 2 o'clock in the morning. And I'm seeing it at 8 a.m. the next day. That could be a warning sign. That person might just want you to say, hey, you good? You want to grab a dinner or something? How many of us have dinner alone these days or coffee alone? Like you might save someone's life. And I know that is extreme, but that's the reality is you might be that one person who reaches out and checks on Chris and says, hey man, you want to grab coffee this weekend? You doing okay? I'm here if you need something. And it's like, oh my God, a relief. It might even not be a trauma dump of 2 hours of somebody expressing how beat up they are over a breakup or the loss of a loved one or just the grind of kids and a family. Could just be, yeah man, it's just nice to get out of my routine and have something to look forward to. There's so much power in optimism and future oriented thinking, and even in the slightest of oh, I'm getting coffee this weekend with my best friend Andy or my brother Cam, whatever it might be. So sorry, John, take it away.
Yeah, no, I would agree, like with the social media thing. It's a platform for people to be able to express things. So we've seen a lot more celebrities, both male and female. But for the sake of this conversation, we have seen male celebrities really, really being honest about their own mental health. We've seen an uptick of the conversation around suicide prevention. And one of the things I've noticed, like in my own life, when I look at the pattern that I am trying to break as the male in my family, seeing from my grandfather, who was a World War II vet, no emotion, pass it down to my father, less emotion, but still some. And then, it gets to me and my brothers, like we're having conversations about it. Even my brother, and it's a little like, personal, but my brother, who's very stoic, is talking about finding a therapist. So I think it's becoming more normalized, and whether that actually transforms into those people actually going to see a therapist, I think there's a lot more work to happen there. But it's at least, people who maybe historically, if they said that, they might have been looked at as extremely weak, or even like this person needs to go into a psychiatric unit because they're talking about how they're feeling. It's an exaggeration, but not far off. But yeah, I think that the conversation has gained a lot of traction, and now we just got to move it into action.
It sounds like it really just, is switching away
Mhm.
from that internalization of your feelings, and that's kind of being the norm and feeling uncomfortable expressing it. Now it's becoming more acceptable with the views of social media, and more access to that, and it's maybe being more powerful coming from a male versus from a female. And again, it can be very different, but I think the bottom line is just really looking at, how, we can be supportive and help one another through this, from a male perspective, but also from a female perspective. I think that's very important. Um, I know,
I'm sorry, Kimberly, I just wanted to interject
mhm.
2 seconds, but also want to just also highlight combating the negative stereotypes that are out there with regards to men. And Bradley, you talked a little bit about it. Chris and John, you all actually talked about it, and me mentioning also the scenario with how BIPOC men are often facing these stereotypes that portray the aggression, the threatening, blue for boys, pink for girls, Barbie, G.I. Joe, that scenario, that literally from birth, there is this conditioning of genderizing, right? What is masculine, what is feminine, and that automatically categorizing anything that's masculine to be aggressive, to be threatening. So if we combat those negative stereotypes, that also can help normalize. So nowadays, when you're seeing the scenarios played out in social media, as you guys are describing, of challenging and combating those negative stereotypes, that also helps to support normalizing the conversation about men and mental health. And so men who whatever in terms of the identification and the normalization of men identifying as men is being challenged because the stereotypes that have been embedded in, from a societal perspective, being stoic, having to, demonstrate strength and facing adversity is actually having to do that and live in that space has actually brought men down to a space of like having to isolate. So that's coming up to the surface. And I think that what we discussed here has helped to normalize and support that. So I just wanted to add that piece.
Definitely. And I want to thank you all. I mean, I think, we really had a, great discussion on this. And just as we kind of conclude today, I just want to remember, remind us it's important to recognize that men's mental health is shaped by many different factors, like we talked about today, social expectations, cultures, upbringing, relationships. There's so many things. And this is just kind of like the beginnings of talking about it. Many boys grow up learning, kind of like we said, to suppress emotions, avoid vulnerability, handle struggles alone. But over time, the messages can contribute to isolation, unhealthy coping behaviors, unresolved trauma, and just overall making it hard for them to make connections. So, like we discussed, the challenges can be identified by cultural pressures, discrimination, stigma, limited access even to support mental health services, in their communities. So we explore the importance of healthy coping skills, strategies, community support, emotional awareness, and open communication. So again, today's conversation should remind us that it's not vulnerability is not a weakness. It's seeking help is not a failure. Emotional expression, connection, self-awareness is so important to mental health and just our overall well-being. And just really creating healthy versions of masculinity doesn't mean removing strength, resilience, responsibility. It's really looking at, definition of strength to include kind of that honesty, having them feel comfortable about their emotional intelligence, empathy, and willing to ask for support when needed. So, we just overall hope this presentation just kind of encourages continued conversations beyond this room. Again, like we said, we've just touched the surface, within your families, friends, schools, workplaces, and communities, just so future generations of men can feel more supported, understood, and be emotional healthy. That's so important for us, for everybody in this room, and just for future generations, to really help kind of break the stigma and really allow people to feel comfortable getting access to services and using them because we want everybody to feel, healthy and happy. So I want to thank you all for attending this participation, and parting in the discussion with the questions and everything. It was great. Maria wanted me to let you all know. Feel free to email her if you want to get a certificate of attendance. And if you would like to get a copy of the video, she could provide that. But just overall, I want to thank you for being here today with us and allowing us to talk about a topic that's very important to all of us in this room. So thank you so much.